Okay, so picture this. You're at this like super fancy psychology conference, right? Awards dinner, the whole 9 yards. And guess what you win? All that hard work, all those late nights with research papers finally paying off. You're feeling pretty good, right?
Hmm.
But here's the thing. As you're walking up to accept that shiny award, your brain, it decides to play a trick on you. It starts whispering, those doubts start creeping in like,
That's exactly.
wait, they're going to find out you're fake any minute. And everyone's going to realize you don't belong here. Sound familiar? That, my friends, is the imposter syndrome bully flexing its muscles. It's that pesky voice that convinces us we're not as talented or as knowledgeable as everyone seems to think, even when we've got the degrees, the certifications, the client testimonials to prove it. And get this imposter thing, it's not just some weird personal quirk. It's incredibly common among mental health professionals. Expert speaker, you've really dug into the research on this. Why is it that we, the helpers, so often feel like the biggest frauds?
Well, it's interesting because the research suggests that somewhere between 70 to 82% of mental health professionals experience this imposter syndrome at some point. That's a huge number of us, and it might seem strange, but the very things that make us good at this work, the empathy, the drive to help others, those things can actually make us more vulnerable to feeling like imposters.
That actually makes a lot of sense. We're always pushing ourselves to be better for our clients, to stay on top of the latest research, new therapies, new studies. It feels like it never ends.
It really doesn't. And the human mind, it's not like we're fixing cars here, right? There's no standard instruction manual for the human experience.
Absolutely. And let's be honest, how many times have you been in a session and thought, oh, wow, I've never encountered this before. What do I do?
Exactly. And because we're dealing with something so deeply personal, our clients' well-being, it's only natural that we feel the pressure to get it right. Every time we don't see immediate progress or a client doesn't respond the way we expected, it's like those seeds of doubt, they start to sprout.
And before you know it, you're questioning everything you do, wondering if you're really cut out for this work. And that kind of self-doubt can be paralyzing. But before we dive deeper into the whole impact of imposter syndrome, I'm curious, where does this voice even come from? Are we born with it or does it develop over time?
It's not like there's a specific imposter syndrome gene that scientists have uncovered, but our early experiences definitely play a role. Like, think about your own childhood. Maybe you had parents who had really high expectations, always pushing you to be the best. Or maybe you had a sibling who excelled in school or sports, and you were always comparing yourself to them.
Those early messages, they stick with us, don't they?
They do. And they can become part of this inner dialogue, whispering doubts even when we achieve great things.
Like our own personal negative hype person.
Yeah.
You can do it, but wait, they're going to figure out you're a phony.
So we've talked about how common imposter syndrome is, but I've heard some people say that a little bit of self-doubt can actually be a good thing. Like, it keeps us humble, keeps us learning and growing as clinicians. Is there some kind of sweet spot between healthy self-reflection and full-blown imposter syndrome? I think that's a really great point because it's not about getting rid of self-doubt completely. That wouldn't be realistic. And honestly, it might not even be helpful. Think of imposter syndrome like a dial, not just an on or off switch.
Yeah.
A little bit of self-doubt, that's what motivates us to keep learning, to seek out supervision, to keep getting better at what we do. It's when that dial gets cranked up too high that it becomes a problem. So true. A little bit of am I good enough can actually push us to improve, but when it turns into I'm a total fraud and everyone's going to find out, that's when it becomes debilitating. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack next. What are the real consequences of letting imposter syndrome run wild? Because this isn't just about hurt feelings, it can impact our careers, our relationships, even our own well-being. Stick around as we explore the not-so-fun side of imposter syndrome and, more importantly, reveal some powerful strategies to help you tame that inner critic once and for all. So before the break, we were talking about how imposter syndrome isn't just this fleeting feeling. It can have some real consequences.
Yeah, it really can. It's not just about feeling a little nervous before a presentation. This stuff can impact our work, our relationships with colleagues, even our own mental health. So let's break that down. What are some of the ways imposter syndrome can actually show up for therapists?
Well, on the surface, you've got the anxiety, the self-doubt, maybe even some depression. When you're constantly second-guessing yourself, it takes a toll.
Right. It's like this constant pressure, never feeling good enough.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Imposter syndrome thrives on secrecy and shame. When that little voice is telling you you're not good enough, you're probably not broadcasting it, right?
Definitely not. It's like the opposite of something you'd want to share.
And that's how it isolates us. We're afraid to reach out for support, afraid to connect with colleagues who might be going through the same thing.
It becomes this vicious cycle. The imposter syndrome feeds on that isolation.
Exactly. And, it can even affect how we perceive our own successes. There was this study where they asked a bunch of high-achieving professionals to talk about a worsen accomplishment. The ones with high imposter syndrome, they often attributed their success to luck or timing anything but their own skills.
So instead of owning their wins, they explain them away.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that this wasn't just about being humble. It actually affected their performance on future tasks because they hadn't internalized those successes. They went into new challenges with less confidence.
Wow, so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And for therapists, this can bleed into how we approach our work. We might overwork ourselves, set poor boundaries, all to avoid looking incompetent.
When in reality, it could be impacting the quality of care we're providing.
That's a really good point. We also need to talk about compassion fatigue and burnout.
Oh boy, those are two words no therapist wants to hear.
I know, right? But it's important to understand the connection. Compassion fatigue, that feeling of being completely drained emotionally and physically from caring for others, and burnout, the state of just complete emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. These are things that a lot of therapists struggle with, and imposter syndrome can make it worse.
So there's actually a link between imposter syndrome and burnout.
There is. A study in 2021 found that therapists with higher levels of imposter syndrome were actually more likely to experience burnout.
That's like those imposter feelings, they chip away at our resilience. So this is all pretty heavy stuff. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about what we can do about it. What are some practical strategies for taming that inner critic?
Well, the first step, and it might seem simple, is just acknowledging that this is a thing you're experiencing. Remember that statistic we talked about earlier? The vast majority of us in this field have felt these feelings at some point.
You're not alone.
Right. You are not alone. And once we acknowledge it, we can start to challenge those negative thoughts.
This is where those CBT skills come in handy,
Right,
right?
exactly. We can use those same tools we use with our clients to help ourselves.
CBT for the therapist, I love it.
So one technique is cognitive restructuring. It's about identifying those automatic negative thoughts, those I'm not good enough stories we tell ourselves, and replacing them with more balanced, realistic ones.
Can you give us an example of how that might work in real life?
Sure. Let's say you're getting ready for an important presentation, and that imposter syndrome voice pops up and says, "You're going to bomb this. You don't know what you're talking about." Cognitive restructuring would involve challenging that thought head on, saying something like, "Wait a minute, I've prepared for this. I know this topic. I'm passionate about sharing this information."
It's about catching those negative thought patterns and consciously choosing to reframe them.
And in addition to reframing those thoughts, we've got to get better at owning our successes. Remember we were talking about how people with imposter syndrome tend to downplay their achievements? Well, it's time to flip the script.
It's like we've been conditioned to apologize for our accomplishments.
It's true. But owning our successes doesn't make us arrogant. It just means acknowledging our hard work and the positive impact we're having.
It's so true, though, isn't it? We're always so quick to celebrate our clients when they make progress. But when it comes to our own achievements, it's like we want to brush them under the rug.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it really does take a conscious effort to change that. One thing I always recommend is creating something I call a victory log.
A victory log.
That's it.
Basically, it's just a place where you keep track of your wins, big or small. It could be a journal, a note on your phone, whatever works for you. Every time something good happens related to your work, write it down. Did a client have a breakthrough in a session? Write it down. Did you get a really nice email from a client? Write it down. Did you nail that presentation you were nervous about? Write it down.
I love that it's like creating this collection of evidence that you're actually good at what you do. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, when those doubts start creeping in, you can pull out your victory log and remind yourself of all the amazing things you've accomplished.
Such a simple but powerful idea. And speaking of powerful tools, we talked earlier about how important it is to share our experiences with others, the good, the bad, the ugly. You mentioned that this could be especially helpful for therapists who are struggling with imposter syndrome.
Absolutely. There's this misconception that vulnerability is a weakness, especially in a field where we're supposed to be the helpers. But in reality, vulnerability is the key to building genuine connections with our colleagues.
It's like Brene Brown says, vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome.
So true. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable with each other, when we share our struggles with imposter syndrome, it helps to normalize the experience. It reminds us that we're not alone in these feelings.
It's like we're breaking down those walls that imposter syndrome tries to build up between us.
And beyond connecting with peers, finding a supervisor or mentor who you trust can be invaluable. They've probably been there themselves. They get it, and they can offer guidance and support based on their own experiences.
It's about building that support system,
Yeah.
right? Having people you can talk to openly and honestly without fear of judgment.
Exactly. Because none of us can do this alone. And another important strategy is learning to embrace imperfection.
Oh, that's a tough one, especially for us recovering perfectionists.
I hear you. It's so easy to get caught up in this striving for perfection, but the truth is perfection doesn't exist. It's an impossible standard that only sets us up for disappointment and self-criticism.
So how do we even begin to shift our thinking away from that?
It's about reframing those mistakes and setbacks as opportunities for growth. Instead of beating yourself up when things don't go perfectly, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? How can I use this experience to get better?
It's about giving ourselves permission to be works in progress, right?
Exactly. We're all constantly learning and growing. And along with embracing imperfection, we need to practice self-compassion. We're often our own harshest critics. Think about it. Would you ever talk to a client or a friend the way you sometimes talk to yourself in your own head?
Probably not.
We need to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we offer to others.
I love that self-compassion as an act of rebellion against the imposter syndrome bully.
You got it. And sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply saying yes, even when that imposter voice is screaming no.
What do you mean by that?
Imposter syndrome wants to keep us small and safe, stuck in our comfort zones. But real growth happens when we challenge ourselves, when we step outside of those boundaries.
So even if we're scared, even if that voice is telling us we're not ready, we should just go for it.
Exactly. Take a chance, say yes to that opportunity, even if it terrifies you.
Because even if we stumble, we'll learn and grow from the experience.
And who knows, you might just surprise yourself with what you're capable of.
This has been such a great conversation. I feel like I've learned so much.
Me too.
As we wrap things up, is there any final wisdom you'd like to share with our listeners?
Just this. If you knew without a doubt that you were good enough, just as you are, what would you do differently in your life and work? What risks would you take? What dreams would you dare to pursue?
Powerful stuff. I hope our listeners will take some time to really sit with that question. Until next time, everyone, remember you are capable, you are worthy, and you are making a difference. Keep shining your light.